Timothy, it's wonderful to have you with us. Thank you for taking the time to join us for the next 30 minutes. Before we dive into current events, I do want to talk about your book, because by all accounts, it is your most personal one to date. It's a blend of contemporary history, reportage, and memoir, and pretty much tells the story of Europe in the later 20th and early 21st centuries. What motivated you to write this book at this particular juncture in time?
Well, first of all, it's a pleasure to be with you virtually. I'm sorry I can't be with you in person because actually the Delphi Forum features in the book. This book took me just 50 years to write. It's a project of 50 years traveling around Europe, studying Europe, worrying about Europe, writing about Europe. It is, as you say, it's history illustrated by memoir and reportage. And if you ask what inspired me to write it, the answer is because I started traveling in Europe in the early 1970s, and for the first roughly 35 years after that, we had a kind of forward and upward march of the spread of freedom in Europe, starting, of course, with the end of the dictatorships in Greece, as well as Spain and Portugal, then in East Central Europe, in the Baltic states, in Ukraine, in Southeastern Europe. But since 2008, the simultaneous events of the global financial crisis and Vladimir Putin's violent seizure of two parts of Georgia, it's been one bloody crisis after another, a cascade of crises. Eurozone crisis, which you know all about in Greece, the demolition of democracy in Hungary, the refugee crisis, Putin's seizure of Crimea and the beginning of the war in eastern Ukraine, Brexit, Trump, COVID, all the way down to the beginning of the largest war in Europe since 1945 on the 24th of February last year. So that the particular impulse for writing the book was a sense that we had actually built the best Europe we've ever seen, the closest we've come to a Europe whole and free. But now the whole thing is under existential threat. And so in a way, it's an appeal to Europeans, particularly young Europeans. And by the way, the book, I'm glad to say, is also coming out in Greece this autumn, to step up to the plate, to defend it and improve it and extend it.
Thank you, Timothy. Timothy, I've had a chance to catch glimpses of your book. Indeed, extremely worthwhile. And you're talking about how unprecedented Europe has emerged from the ashes of World War II to make progress, become a beacon of hope and liberalization. But of course, it is more than anything a plea to call on the European citizens to understand and defend what we have collectively achieved. Let's talk about Europe, a war that's now been going on for the past 15 months. If you're looking at Europe's record here, is Europe doing enough to aid and support Ukraine in their fight for sovereignty and independence?
The short answer is no. But let me first of all say that we wouldn't be in this war at all if we had woken up to what was happening at the latest in 2014. Because there's a clear pattern from history, which is that empires don't give up without a struggle. So when the largest land empire in Europe, the Russian Soviet Empire, just softly and suddenly vanished away in 3 years, 1989 to 1991, we shouldn't have assumed that was the end of the story. So when the empire started striking back, and that's exactly what's happening, particularly at the latest in 2014, we should have taken much more decisive action then. Then we should have had the heavy sanctions on Russia, then the military support for Ukraine, then getting rid of the dirty Russian money swilling around what they call London Grad, then reducing Germany's energy dependency on Russia, then sending a clearer signal to Putin. So rather like what happened in the 1930s, we're in this mess because of earlier failures. In terms of what we do now, the only way to a lasting peace in this situation is through war. It's a shocking fact, but it is through a successful Ukrainian campaign, which will start in the next few weeks, in which young Ukrainian men and women will lose their lives or be badly wounded, a successful Ukrainian campaign, which actually brings something that one might call Ukrainian victory. And that depends on our arms and ammunition supplies and our training. And if we haven't done enough of it, and we'll only know when the campaign has started, what that means is not peace. It's going to mean a much longer, more grinding war, which is actually going to cost us much more in terms of our support and our economies.
Many observers of EU affairs have praised the European Union for standing together, for presenting a unified front throughout this conflict, saying Vladimir Putin did not expect Europe to demonstrate and display this robust front. But then there are others who say, well, the unified front, at least in detail, may be cracking. If we're seeing Hungary's position, we're saying now how some countries are positioning themselves when it comes to grain imports from Ukraine. Are you, as a passionate European and an observer of European affairs, are you satisfied with the unified front that Europe has displayed in the previous 15 months?
Well, one can never be wholly satisfied, but what I would say is, you know, there's a challenge and response mechanism. It's sometimes called the crisis theory of progress, that the EU integration proceeds through crisis, but the truth is, sometimes it doesn't, sometimes it doesn't. I would be hard pushed to say how the refugee crisis, for example, had actually catalyzed desirable European integration. But I think this one has. The fact that we've kept our unity on sanctions despite players like Hungary, the fact that we have something called a European Peace Facility, which is now directly commissioning arms and ammunition for Ukraine. That's a remarkable progress for the EU. So on the whole, yes, I think it has responded very well, and I'd like to pay tribute also to Ursula von der Leyen for her leadership in this respect. But of course, as I just said a moment ago, you know, the bigger test may yet be to come. If the war grinds on, because the Ukrainians are not able to break through to the Sea of Azov, actually threaten Crimea, threaten a decisive victory, bring Russia to the negotiating table, then we're in for a much longer conflict, a much longer haul, and there one would have to worry about European Union, unity. Although in fact, I think the much bigger danger is the one you mentioned a moment ago with Richard Haas, which is a Trump victory in the US. That's the one that would be really disastrous for Ukraine.
I had the pleasure and chance of sharing the stage this morning here in Delphi with former German President Christian Wulff. Germany, obviously, when we're talking Europe, Germany, a pivotal country. You're an astute observer of German affairs. You're fluent in the German language. It had a bit of a change of heart due to the war in Ukraine. German Chancellor Scholz obviously announcing the big Zeitenwende, the change of times. Germany is now dropping its restrictive thought process when it comes to defending itself, to security policies, living up to its obligations. I wonder if you could comment quickly on Germany's role here.
So obviously Germany is Europe's central power, so it's crucial to this story. I distinguish in my book between the post-war period, post-1945, and what I call the post-wall period, after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And of course, Germany, more than almost any other country, fell prey to the post-wall hopes, or if you like, illusions, that we could move towards a Kantian state of perpetual peace, that peace could be secured not by military means, but by economic interdependence, dialogue, diplomacy, interconnection. And so the distance that Germany has had to travel since the 24th of February 2022 is larger than that of almost any other country, possibly Switzerland. So it's come a long way. It's come too slowly in terms of arms deliveries. I think Olaf Scholz's foot dragging on arms deliveries was very unfortunate because, the Ukrainians need those Leopard tanks right now. But it has moved a long way. It's now one of the major military and economic supporters of Ukraine. The key question, I think, is how sustainable will be that support? And in particular, how committed is Germany really to the strategic agenda of the eastward enlargement of the EU, and I would say eventually of NATO, which is the only way in which we're ultimately going to secure the sovereignty, peace, and freedom of Ukraine. In that agenda, the agenda of the new eastward enlargement of the West, if you like, to which Germany is in principle signed up. But the real question is how deep is the actual political commitment to that agenda?
You mentioned and expressed your concern about how Ukraine policies in the United States might change if President Trump got elected. There are some voices within Europe, President Macron obviously most notable, something that I've asked Francois Eisbourg and Richard Haas here before, prior to you joining us. The thought process being that Europe should no longer depend as much as it did in the past on American leadership. I wonder if I can get your take on that.
So I think Emmanuel Macron, who always has very interesting thoughts, I think that interview was very unfortunate because in saying that European unity was the most important thing, he actually damaged European unity. Because his vision, which is what I would call a Euro-Gaullist vision, of a Europe defining itself against the United States, becoming what he called a third pole in world affairs, is one which is always going to divide Europeans. It did so in the Iraq War. It did so again in reaction to his interview. What the war in Ukraine has shown us is that the only way in which you can actually unite European public opinion is in a strategic partnership with the United States. So European public opinion is quite united on support for Ukraine, firstly because it's clearly a good cause, but secondly because it is precisely not against the United States, but in strategic partnership with the United States. So that what we definitely need is more European power. I'm a great believer in law of puissance. We have to build up all dimensions of our power, including military power, but without the illusion that we're going to be able to do it all alone for the foreseeable future, and without the motivation that says we're doing this to become a separate pole in world affairs. Now, obviously, if Trump arrives and pulls the rug, then we'll have to get on with that rather fast. But that shouldn't be what we're aiming for. We should be aiming to build up European power in a strategic partnership with the United States, in the Euro-Atlanticist version of it, not the Euro-Gaullist vision.
In the remaining minutes of this session, let's include a couple of questions from the audience. Can we get the microphone to the lady in the first row? Yes. And please introduce yourself. Speak up so that Timothy can hear us clearly.
Thank you very much. My question, you've described how remarkable Western response has been to Russia's actions in Ukraine, and you said that the biggest test is yet to come. So my question is that, sorry, I forgot, I'm Marina Vorotnyuk, I'm Associate Fellow with RUSI in London. So my question would be is, whether you would agree with the assessment, or in your opinion it's an overstatement that the collective West is likely to fail this test in future if it doesn't change its stance on, it displays at the moment, I would say, lots of self-deterrence or lots of risk aversion, fear of escalation with Russia, as the discussions around the provisions of weapons to Ukraine showed. The United States, but other Western countries as well, openly advertise the red lines, what they won't do to help Ukraine. So what is your take on that? Thank you.
So broadly speaking, I agree with you, although obviously we have to look at the risks of escalation and evaluate them carefully. But the fact is, the only way to a lasting peace is Ukrainian victory. Ukrainian victory means Russian defeat, and in particular, Putin's defeat. He's not going to like that, and therefore, as we approach Ukrainian victory, I hope we will, the level of risk is going to go up. There's going to be an escalation from Putin's side, but we're never going to get to the point of victory unless we're prepared to take on that risk. So while we have to be sober in our assessment of what the dangers are and make contingency planning, I think we do need more of that quality which, and this for me is a word of the year, the Ukrainian word that you will know, which is volia. Volia, which is a Ukrainian word which means both will or willpower and freedom. We need more of that basic readiness to fight for freedom. So I think there's a moment of increased risk, but also of increased opportunity that may be just weeks or months away. And I don't think the West, either its political elites, let alone public opinion, is actually psychologically prepared for that moment.
One last look into the audience. If there are any questions, that doesn't seem to be the case. We have, yes, Nick Gowan at the very last second. Please, can we get him the microphone? Someone you should know well, Timothy.
Hi, Tim. Nick here. Just picking up on what you just said there about political elites and the public. And we were talking about this with Francois Eisberg in the last hour. What about the capacity of the current political class, including the military leaders and security leaders, to appreciate the scale of abnormality that they're now facing, and therefore their ability to handle it, and handle it with that level of risk and opportunity that you've just been putting?
Thank you, Nick. I think it's highly variable. I think that the military in the NATO context have woken up to precisely that and do understand the challenge. I think political elites are much further behind. I mean, one way to test this would be to ask the question, is Europe at war? Are we a continent at war? Because I think many people in our political leadership, let alone in public opinion, would say no. And the much more realistic way to approach it is to say, yes, we are actually in important senses at war. And therefore, there's a much larger scale of adjustment to be made. We actually need to reshape our defense industry and our defense postures quite fundamentally. And we need to prepare our public opinions, both for the risk and opportunity of the next few months, but also for the longer haul. So I think there's quite a long way to go, but I think that the military and the experts are already confronting that extraordinary change.
Timothy, in your book, you write very clearly about the path that Europe has taken since post-45, how it was rebuilt, how it was liberated, and how it was unified to come very close to the ideals of a Europe whole, free, and at peace. You very passionately plead for all Europeans to understand and defend what we have collectively achieved. How concerned are you? Clearly you're concerned that we may lose all those achievements, but how concerned are you as far as the future of Europe is concerned? Or rather, let me rephrase, how optimistic are you that despite the strings of crises that this continent has gone through, it will still prevail and remain strong in the years and decades to come?
So analytically, it's quite difficult to be excessively optimistic, not only because of the problems being generated or that have been generated inside Europe, and we haven't even talked about Brexit and the Eurozone and fiscal rules and all those other problems, but also because we have a particularly challenging external environment with the Chinese superpower, aligned with Russia, with other non-Western great powers, still having very good relations with Russia, with the challenges of climate change, global population, mass migration, and so on, so that above all, the external environment is enormously challenging. But what I would say in conclusion is that the necessary combination is pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. So one quick lesson from the history I describe in the book. If you remember, back in the 1970s, we were in quite a deep crisis. But because we had the pessimism of the intellect, we recognized how serious the problems were and addressed them. In the early to mid-2000s, we had an excessive intellectual optimism. We thought everything was going so well, everything was going our way, the direction of democracy and peace and freedom. And that's precisely when the problem started. So actually, I think the mix we need in this situation is that famous combination of pessimism of the intellect, understanding how profound the problems are, analyzing the big changes we need to make to address them, but also that optimism of the will, and in optimism of the will, we can certainly take a page out of the Ukrainian book.
Timothy Garton-Nash, you may not see it from where you're sitting, but you were speaking to a packed audience here in Delphi, a packed room, which listened very intently and carefully about your words about Europe. For everyone, the book is called Homelands, A Personal History of Europe. It is the new splendid book of Timothy Garton-Nash, and we thank him for joining us here at the Delphi Economic Forum. Thank you so much, Timothy.